Hi everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. I got a pretty interesting one for you today. We're going to go into why Chromatic Orb is secretly good. But real quick, did you know that 86% of my viewers aren't subscribed yet? That is actually up 4% from the 90% previously, so thank you so much to my new subscribers who have helped close that gap a little bit. But if you are part of that 86% and you keep clicking on these videos, please consider subscribing to my channel. It does help me out quite a bit. But that's all I'm going to say on that for now. We're going to deep dive into Chromatic Orb. Hello everyone, real quick self-insert here. I'm recording this after the entirety of the video you're watching now has been recorded. But today is my wife and I's 5th wedding anniversary, so I just recently started recording these videos, so she kind of surprised me with this cool gosh dang shirt that has my logo on it. So I think this is just so cool. I can't wait to wear it. I'm not saying that I have like a merch shop or anything available right now. I don't even know how that would work. But I just wanted to show this off because I think it's so gosh dang cool. And then in addition to that, she got me this cool branded mug that again has the main logo on it, as well as the banner that's on the YouTube channel as well. I don't even know if I'm going to drink out of this because I might just have it around as a decoration because I'm afraid that it might, wear off over time in the dishwasher. I'm not quite sure how that would work, but I just think it's so cool. I went around on my desk, but yeah, I just wanted to show that off. So let's go ahead and get back to the video. Again, it has undergone some changes here. Let's take a look at what I'm talking about. So the new rules for Chromatic Orb are right in front of you. So the first paragraph here is basically the same as it always was. You hurl an orb of energy at a target. You can choose acid, fire, cold, lightning, poison, or thunder for the damage type. You make a ranged spell attack against the target, and then they take 3d8 damage of that chosen type. Same as it always was, hasn't changed. This second paragraph, however, says, if you roll the same number on 2 or more of the d8s, the orb leads to a different target of your choice within range. You make a new attack roll against that target. You make a new damage roll if you hit them. And then the orb can't leap again unless you cast a spell with a 2nd level or higher spell slot. So then if we look at the upcasting for it, the using a higher level spell slot, it says the damage increases by 1d8 for each spell level above the first, which is the same as it always was. And then the orb can leap a maximum number of times equal to the level of the spell slot expended, and a creature can be targeted only once by each casting of the spell. So you can't bounce it multiple times between the same target. A little unfortunate, but it is a set, first level spell. It would be very powerful, as we'll see a bit later, if we could just bounce it between more like a couple targets. But that's pretty cool. So I think people were comparing this basically to Chaos Bolt, which has a similar bouncing effect. But it's not quite a fair comparison because Chaos Bolt works a little differently. And what does that look like? So the Chaos Bolt text is very similar. You make a ranged spell attack against a target. On a hit, the target takes 2d8 plus 1d6 damage. And then it says a little bit more stuff, but then it says, if you roll the same number on both d8s, then it bounces and then you roll a new attack and so forth. And then when it says at higher levels, when you cast it at 2nd level or higher, the target takes an extra 1d6 damage of each type, of the chosen type for each slot level above the first, not a d8. So we can see that Chaos Bolt can only bounce if the 2d8s that you have on that spell roll the same number. It only ever has 2d8s regardless of the spell at which is cast. Chromatic Orb, on the other hand, starts with 3d8s, and then it continues to get more d8s as you upcast it, which dramatically increases the chances that it's going to bounce per spell level. So what does that look like, right? So the probability of bouncing, we can figure out what the odds of it bouncing at each spell level is, just by figuring out the odds of it not bouncing and then subtracting that from 1. And because the spell only bounces if at least 2 dice match, we can basically ignore the results of the first die and only factor in the odds that subsequent dice match one of the previous ones. So what does that look like? So for Chromatic Orb, which is 2d8, we take 1 minus 7 over 8, which is the chance that that second dice will not be the same as the first one, which is a 12.5% chance. So the Chaos Bolt, no matter what spell level you cast it at, only ever has a 12.5% chance to bounce. Whereas Chromatic Orb, just at first level, again, we take 1 minus that 7 over 8 times the 6 over 8, because that third dice now has only 6 out of possible 8 chances that the value of that dice will not match one of the other 2 dice, right? Which gives us a 34.38% chance to bounce. So we can see that even at first level, Chromatic Orb is almost 3 times as likely to bounce than Chaos Bolt. Then what does that look like at 2nd level and 3rd level and so forth, right? Well, we can easily extrapolate that down by just expanding the formula that we have here. So then we can see that we go from 34.38% at level 1 to at level 2, we have almost 59% chance to bounce. Level 3 is about 79.5% chance to bounce. Level 4 is 92.31% chance to bounce. Level 5 is then 98.8. Level 6 is when we have 8d8, which means that the only way that we don't bounce is if we get 1 through 8 on each of the dice, which is very unlikely. So we have a 99.76% chance to bounce. And then anything at level 7 or higher, we're rolling more than 8d8, which means that 9th die is always going to match one of the other 8 dice, right? So that's pretty dang cool, because that is a pretty quick scaling. That's, it's approaching near certainty as you go higher level and you're upcasting with Chromatic Orb. Not to mention, it is an attack roll, so you can critically hit, and when you do critically hit, you're rolling double the number of dice, which then means that you have you're guaranteed to bounce even earlier, depending on what the level of the spell is, right? So then what can we do with that information? So now we can calculate the probability of bouncing in a row, right? So I think it was, what was it? Yeah, we have the level 2 Chromatic Orb. The base probability for it was that 58.98% chance. So that's the probability of each bounce individually, but what's the odds that we hit both bounces in one casting of the spell? We can figure that out by taking the base probability to the power of the number of bounces. So again, for example, that level 2 Chromatic Orb is bouncing at 0.5898%, or not percent, but 0.5898 to the power of 2 for 2 bounces. If we extend that out to all the bounces for each spell level, this is the chart that we end up with. So we can see that for that level 2 Chromatic Orb, 58.98% chance for the first bounce, but to bounce both times to all 3 targets, it is a 34.79% chance. So then again, we can see at level 3 goes from 80% chance to about a 50% chance to hit all 3 targets. And then level 4 is a 92% chance to bounce off that first target, but then to subsequently bounce off each individual target, it goes down to 72.61% chance. At level 5, it's kind of approaching near certainty, and I think even at 98.08% chance, you basically have to, you're not rolling a natural 1, but it's basically the equivalent of rolling a natural 1, right? And then at level 6, you're basically guaranteed to bounce every time, and then at level 7 and beyond, you are guaranteed to bounce every time. So that's pretty cool. It is worth remembering that the spell can only bounce the number of times equal to the spell level. It can only bounce to a target once. So the viable number of targets of each spell level is spell level +1. And then there may be times that we want to just upcast it, even if we don't have the right number of targets, just to make sure that we bounce the number of times that we want to, right? Because there's a pretty big difference between level 3 and level 4. There's a pretty big difference between 4 and 5. And then at 7, of course, it's guaranteed if we aren't going to be using that 7th level spell slot for anything else, and we just want to bounce off a bunch of different creatures, we can make that value proposition to see if it's worth it for us to do that, because it does a lot of damage at 7th level as well. We'll take a look at that later. Okay, so what about the probability of hitting each time, right? So we can assume that there's about a 65% chance to hit without advantage, and then we can expand that out to 87.75% chance to hit with advantage, and then we can again calculate the probability of hitting consecutively in a row each time by the base probability of either 65% chance or 87.75% chance to the power of the spell level +1, which is the number of targets. So for example, that first level Chromatic Orb, if it hits every target, or the chance for it to hit every target is that 0.65 to the second power, because there's 2 targets, which is a 42.25% chance. So then if we just expand that out to every level, so again, you're bouncing, twice at level 1, 3 times at level 2, and so on and so forth. The odds of bouncing at each level drop pretty dramatically if you are not, if you just had that base 65% chance to hit without advantage. However, with advantage, it's actually somewhat reasonable. Like those are risks that I probably would take. Advantage also drops the odds of rolling a natural 1 to 1 in 400, which greatly increases our chance to hit. It also increases the chance to crit, which then increases our chance to bounce. I didn't calculate or crunch the numbers for using Elven accuracy, but if you did, I kind of included what the numbers would be to hit at each level, and you can kind of see how much even better that is. It's almost double, even at the 9th level for hitting 9 targets in a row. It's almost double the probability, or even it's actually more than double the probability than just hitting with advantage. So if you're using Elven accuracy within your 2024 rules and you're wanting to use Chromatic Orb, it's a very good combination. However, it is important to remember that in practice, we'll probably be dealing with a variety of different ACs, like the creatures we're bouncing off of are going to have a variety of different armor classes. So it's a little harder to imagine what our hit probability is going to be. We kind of can gauge what different things are, just based on kind of, okay, this guy rolled, 17 over here and he missed, so it's probably higher than 17. This person hit on a 12. They're probably at least, have an AC of 12. We can kind of make those decisions. But again, this is a situation where we'll need to make a value proposition where do we want to try to get the most out of the spell by bouncing off attacking the lowest armor class creature first, or the one that we think has the lowest armor class, and seeing how much we can bounce off them? Or do we want to try to target the creature with the highest AC first because they're the priority target, and make sure we at least get damage in on them? And kind of what spell level do we want to cast at to try to do that, right? For that reason, because there's so much variance in armor classes when you're hitting multiple targets, I don't think it's super important to consider the consecutive probability to hit. There's too many variables to actually consider for, but I did want to point out, I did want to do this exercise to point out just how important advantage is, or even, elven accuracy is, to more than, because again, at 7th level or higher, you are guaranteed to bounce. So at that point, you just want to make sure that you are almost guaranteed to hit. So we can see how dramatically having advantage or having elven accuracy increases the chance that you hit each target and then bounce off each target, right? So let's look into damage then, since we're talking about damage. So when I'm calculating damage, again, I'm going to ignore the consecutive probability to hit, but we will consider the consecutive probability to bounce. And I think that's also important because that probability to bounce isn't just the probability that we bounce, but it also represents the subset of the combination of rolls that we can get that actually matter to us because we want it to bounce, right? Which means that there's a whole bunch of damage rolls that we don't want. We don't want to see them because we don't bounce, right? So that's why I want to consider the consecutive probability of bouncing in with these damage numbers. So the formulas are right in front of you. We have the initial damage, which is the damage of the first hit, which is of course going to be the dice average times the hit percent. And then we're going to add the dice average times the crit percent, because that hit can, of course, crit. And then we have a separate formula for subsequent damage, which is the previous answer plus the damage, the average damage of the dice times the hit percent times the consecutive bounce percent. And then we add the crit damage on top of that, because, again, each individual hit can crit. So if we do that, again, this is just for attacking with normal. So this is a 65% chance to hit. This is what our table looks like at each spell level, at each bounce for each spell level, right? So it's at 260 damage at level 9, which isn't really that much damage, to be honest. But again, this is we saw how much accuracy matters when you're trying to hit multiple targets. So let's look at what this looks like at advantage. So if we move up to advantage, again, keeping in mind that at level 9, if we hit all 9 targets, we're expecting to do about 260 damage. When we have advantage, that bounces up to 482, just under 500, right? That's almost double what it was previously just for having advantage. The 260 at 9 targets at 9th level spell for attacking normally is about the same amount of damage that we're doing with a 6th level Chromatic Orb hitting 6 targets, right? So advantage is very, very important. If you're going to be using Chromatic Orb in this sort of pinball way, you probably want to make sure you have a source of advantage. I do want to look real quick just at unadjusted sources or unadjusted numbers for damage. So for unadjusted, what I mean by that is we're going to set hit to 1. We're going to set bounce probability to 1, which means 100%. We're going to assume that we hit. We're going to assume that we bounce. Dice amounts are still average. We're still factoring in the critical hit chance. So for the normal attacks, we're assuming that we hit, but there's a 5% chance crit there. We're looking at 520 damage for 9 targets at level 9. And then, I'm sorry, it's 10 targets at level 9, right? And then for the firing with advantage at the 9.75% chance to crit, there isn't a big difference there. So the chance to crit doesn't matter quite as much unless we crit multiple times, of course. And there's always that variance. But I just wanted to give, because I just think that the numbers, especially for the first one, look very small. But I want to show like how much damage you really could do, assuming that you do hit and assuming that you do bounce every time. The numbers are actually a little bit higher. Just based on the average dice rolls, right? So let's look at this. Who uses the Chromatic Orb the best then? And again, we want an active source of advantage as much as possible. Without any other tricks, I think the Sorcerer is obviously the standout best here, not only because they have innate sorcery, which is sort of like a rage for sorcerers. They have advantage on all their attack rolls for 1 minute twice per day while this ability is active. But also specifically, the Wild Magic Sorcerer has a lot of on-demand advantage through the Tides of Chaos feature, which is something that they get at level 3. So they can just give themselves advantage on any d20 test, which includes an attack roll, of course. And then once you do, you can cast a sorcerer spell that uses a spell slot, which will immediately refresh that use of advantage, so you can use it on your next attack roll. That also immediately triggers a Wild Magic Surge, so you have a lot of on-demand advantage, not only through innate sorcery, but through the Tides of Chaos as a Wild Magic Sorcerer. So if you really want to triple down on this pinball wizard, Chromatic Orb with a Wild Magic Sorcerer is going to be nuts, especially if you have Elven Accuracy as well. So what are the advantages of using Chromatic Orb, right? So I think it, just based on what we looked at before, I think it easily has one of the highest damage ceilings of any first level spell, assuming you're not cheesing it with like, a familiar doing something crazy like dropping a Rod of God from, space or something like that. Just using those spells, honestly, it probably has one of the highest damage ceilings of a first level spell. It can be used in place of an AoE spell if you want to hit multiple targets, but you don't have something like Careful Spell to exclude your allies from that damage radius. So you can just pinball off a bunch of enemies and move around your allies that way. It can be used to hit multiple targets that are just too far spread apart to be hit by a traditional AoE spell. It does have a base range of 90 feet, which is pretty generous. But that's only for the first target. If there are targets within 30 feet of it, but beyond that 90 feet, you can ricochet to them. Now, you're not tethered to creatures within 30 feet of that, still within that 90-foot radius, right? Again, like I said, the chance to hit can be increased further by a reliable source of advantage, and especially if you have the Elven Accuracy feat, which also increases the crit chance to just under 15%. It does have a modular damage type, which should allow you to bypass monster resistances in the vast majority of situations. We know this won't include things like monsters that are resistant to the damage of all spells or anything like that, but thunder damage is almost as good as force damage with how little it is resisted. So in a pinch, you can usually just rely on thunder damage. Depending on your DM, this one might be a little up to the personal whims of the DM, but it may work with the new wording of the twin spell, the meta magic for the sorcerers, which allows you to basically upcast the spell level by 1 for spells that get more targets when they upcast. The upcasting rules for Chromatic Orb don't explicitly say that you can target an additional creature. It just says that you can bounce an additional time. But in order to bounce that time, you do have to be able to target a new creature. So it's kind of implicit in the function of the spell. But again, your mileage may vary. If your DM does allow it, it's pretty powerful because we saw how good it is to be able to upcast Chromatic Orb and have that higher chance to bounce, the more damage and everything like that. So it's very, very good. So again, your mileage may vary. Hopefully your DM is generous. If they are, tell them thank you. And again, because the spell is so versatile, and because it becomes more reliable the more you upcast it, you can kind of rely on this as sort of your big damage nuke. You might have this will give you the freedom to choose a utility or a control spell at higher levels, where you might be like, I just want a bigger spell that does a lot of damage. But you might say like, oh, but I have Chromatic Orb and I have advantage and I have Elven Accuracy. I can pretty reliably hit a bunch of targets if I upcast it, if I need to. So you might be able to pick different spells than you would normally do. So let's take a look at what I mean by that, right? So looking at first level spells, again, we're only going to be comparing common damaging spells that have an instantaneous duration, because that is exactly what a Chromatic Orb is. There are other reasons you would pick a spell other than damage, such as a lingering effect or anything like that, but we're just talking about damage in this situation. And then it's also important to note that spells with saving throws at least usually do half damage on a save, which is basically your guaranteed damage with those spells no matter what happens, unless they have evasion or something crazy, but otherwise it is guaranteed damage on each target that hits. Whereas Chromatic Orb, if it misses, it stops the chain reaction. If it doesn't bounce, it stops the chain reaction. So that's something to consider as well when you're considering what spells you're picking, if you're also using Chromatic Orb pretty like we're describing, like this pinball. So at first level, we have Chromatic Orb, Burning Hands, Guiding Bolt, Ice Knife, and Thunder Wave. Burning Hands, it would need to hit like 3 targets to even be comparable. Assuming that the Chromatic Orb hits 2 targets. Guiding Bolt is only a single target spell. It barely does more damage than Chromatic Orb on a single target, but Chromatic Orb can also bounce about again, about 30 something% of the time. I think it's about 35% of the time. Ice Knife, it's kind of a cool spell. It does have a very tight radius at 5 feet for that explosion, and you'd probably need to hit quite a few creatures to match the damage of Chromatic Orb. And then Thunderwave, you would need to hit at least 4 creatures with Thunderwave to actually do more damage than Chromatic Orb. Otherwise, you're doing just as much at 3 creatures. But it also does push back, so if you still want Thunderwave, it's perfectly viable as well. But even at first level, I think Chromatic Orb is very much a very nice standout. Moving on to second level, we have Chromatic Orb, Scorching Ray, and Shatter. I think the comparison between Chromatic Orb and Scorching Ray is actually pretty interesting here, because Chromatic Orb can only do up to 21 damage. It can drill it all into one target, but just based on the base damage of Chromatic Orb on one target, it also does 18 damage, which is only 3 damage less than the Scorching Ray. However, it can also bounce up to 2 more targets and do 18. That's 54 damage on average to 3 targets total. 18 damage each. So that's pretty cool. I think so. This is actually a pretty good competitor for Scorching Ray if you don't care about being able to drill into a single target. And even if you are drilling into a single target, 1 damage of Chromatic Orb, it's pretty similar. You just don't have as many chances to crit or the ability to trigger multiple damage riders like a Hex or anything like that. Moving on to third level, then this is where we get interesting spells like Fireball, right? So we have Chromatic Orb, Conjure Barrage, Fireball, Lightning Bolt, and Tidal Wave. I still think you would take Fireball even with Chromatic Orb, just because it's such a good spell. But Lightning Bolt, Chromatic Orb is definitely better than Lightning Bolt, because the odds of you getting enough targets to make Lightning Bolt do more damage in a line is probably pretty low. So even with Chromatic Orb doing less damage per hit, you're more likely to be able to reach 4 targets within the ricochets than you would be able to line that many targets up in a straight line, right? And then Tidal Wave is a little harder to evaluate, but if you hit enough targets in that 30-foot area, that 30-foot, 30-foot by 10-foot area, you could do probably a little more damage, but it's harder to do. Let's move on to fourth level. Fourth level has Chromatic Orb, Blight, Ice Storm, and Psychic Glance. Blight is a single target spell only. It should do more damage on a single target, but again, Chromatic Orb can bounce. Ice Storm is sort of similar to Fireball. It does a little less damage, but has the same radius, but it can be cast from very, very far away. I think it has some additional effects as well. You might still want to take that if you want those additional effects. Psychic Glance, again, single target nuke does even less damage than Blight, but it also incapacitates the target if they fail that intelligence save. So you might still take Psychic Glance, but again, Chromatic Orb is still pretty competitive on damage here, considering it can bounce up to 5 targets, because again, that 27 is just the first target that gets hit. If it even bounces to 1 target, it's doing more damage than all of these spells at 1 target, right? Moving on to level 5, this is when we get Cone of Cold, Conjure Volley, Destructive Wave, Flame Strike, Steel Wind Strike, and Synaptic Static. Again, Chromatic Orb is very similar to the damage numbers of all of these spells, and it can hit up to 6 targets here. And this is level 5, so we're not absolutely certain to bounce every time, nor are we, of course, certain to hit every time, but assuming we do hit, the likelihood of us bouncing every time is pretty high. And I think the likelihood of us bouncing at least a few times, assuming that we hit, is pretty good. So it's like, how many people are usually hitting in a Cone of Cold? How many people are usually hitting in a Conjure Volley, Destructive Wave, Flame Strike, etc.? Chromatic Orb can kind of be a stand-in for a lot of these spells if you're building around it in the way that we're talking about, right? If we move on to level 6, I think level 6 is when we get the biggest, the closest comparison to Chromatic Orb, which is Chain Lightning. Because, if you have a lightning ball that's bouncing around, it's basically the same as Chain Lightning, right? Chain Lightning does 10d8 to up to 4 targets. Again, they can save for half damage. Chromatic Orb does 36 average damage to up to 7 targets. So again, Chain Lightning, 45 average damage to 4 targets versus 36 average damage to up to 7 targets. You only need to hit, and again, at 6th level, you have to roll 1 through 8 on all of your dice to not bounce. So as long as you're hitting your targets, you only have to hit 5 of them to do more damage than a Chain Lightning, or as much damage as a Chain Lightning at least. It's pretty comparable at 5 targets. And then beyond that, if you hit a 6th target or a 7th target, then you're just doing more damage than Chain Lightning. Circle of Death, it has the same amount of damage, but it is a very big radius. You could probably catch a lot of creatures in that. I would probably still take Disintegrate, because I think Disintegrate is just a huge nuke for 1, and it's just a very cool spell for 2. Harm, you know, you might choose to take Chromatic Orb over Harm just because it is pretty significantly less damage. However, it's also very close. Close enough that, you know, the ability to hit more than one target with it. You might as well, like, you know what, if I'm going to upcast a damaging spell at 6th level, I might as well just choose Chromatic Orb, and then I can pick a, you know, a different utility spell at 6th level or anything like that, and then rather than choosing something like Harm. Moving on to 7th level, how does it compare at 7th level? We have Finger of Death, Firestorm, and Prismatic Spray. I think Firestorm is a pretty good comparison here because you get 10-foot cubes, whereas the Chromatic Orb has up to 8 targets at this point. It's doing 40.5 damage average compared to Firestorm doing 38.5 damage average. You know, Firestorm can technically get more targets in its areas. However, how often is it that you actually have all those targets to hit, right? So in that way, if you don't even have 10 targets to hit, if you only have 8 targets to hit, then Chromatic Orb is going to do more damage, right? Because it's already doing more average damage as long as you hit with each bounce. And at level 7, you are guaranteed to bounce. You just need to make sure that you hit, right? So we can see that Chromatic Orb is pretty comparable to a lot of these higher level spells, which is pretty cool to see. Moving on, we got 8th level spells. There's only one 8th level instantaneous damage dealing spell, which is Sunburst. It does 42 average damage to, again, creatures in a 60-foot radius. Chromatic Orb does 45 average damage to up to 9 targets. How often do you have more than 9 targets in a combat, right? I think it's pretty, again, you're 100% likely to bounce. You just need to make sure that you hit. So it's possible that Chromatic Orb could do more damage than a Sunburst at 8th level. Pretty interesting. Then finally we get up to 9th level. So I think nothing is ever going to beat Meteor Swarm. We wouldn't expect it to. We wouldn't even want it to. Meteor Swarm is great. It's a fun spell to cast. However, Power Word Kill is its own spell. It's a single target nuke, so we'd expect it to do quite a bit more damage. However, if we look at Psychic Scream, it's almost the same spell, right? Psychic Scream, it is a saving throw technically, so it's not an attack roll, but you can choose up to 10 targets within a 90-foot radius. On a failed save, they will be stunned, which is something Chromatic Orb obviously isn't doing, but they take, you know, 49 average damage as well, or half of that on a save. But Chromatic Orb is, again, 100% chance to bounce, doing 49.5% or 49.5 damage average. If you hit every time, if you hit all 10 targets, it's basically going to do the same amount of damage. They just won't be stunned. You should, I mean, if you still want to take Psychic Scream, absolutely do it. The stun is absolutely worth it on all those creatures. But we can just see how good Chromatic Orb is if it's still comparable to a spell like Psychic Scream, right? So let me know what you think about this, because I think this is pretty cool, pretty interesting. Again, I think the Sorcerer is by far the biggest standout for classes that can kind of use and abuse this the most. Just even if you're not using Elven Accuracy, just the ability to have pretty regular advantage, even with just innate sorcery, or especially with that wild magic sorcery using Tides of Chaos, they're going to go nuts with the Chromatic Orb. If they're allowed to use Elven Accuracy, it's going to be even crazier with Chromatic Orb. I kind of want to play a character like that at some point. I just think that'd be a lot of fun just to pinball this thing as many times as I can. But let me know what you think about this in the comments. You know, was there any math that you thought I thought I should have done that I didn't? Are there any class combinations that you're thinking of that maybe I'm not thinking about because I'm just so focused on the Sorcerer? Let me know. And again, if you liked this video and you liked what you saw here, please hit that subscribe button. Again, 86% of my viewers aren't subscribed yet. You know, we got the numbers up a little bit from my last video. We can get them up again within another week, I think. And again, while you're on the way down to those comments, please hit that like button. And again, I thank you so much for watching. Again, we have a new video coming out this next Wednesday. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you next time.